One thing I absolutely love about Linux discourse is the rehashing of ancient arguments which, frankly, I don't know why anyone cares about anymore. One of those being systemd, another being pulse audio, another being whether or not Wayland is the future of the desktop, and today I want to talk about 32-bit support. At this point, the distro you're using probably doesn't have 32-bit support. There are projects that do still support it. You have Arch Linux 32, but even Debian is phasing out 32-bit. And you even have Firefox phasing out their 32-bit support that should be gone by 2026. Whether that actually happens then, we'll have to wait and see, but this is the current date they are working around. Now, there are absolutely 32-bit systems still in production, and honestly, there's probably going to be 32-bit systems in production until the end of time, let alone the fact that there are still ARM32 chips being produced, and if the industry needs it, there will be a market that provides it. However, a lot of these deployments are old deployments, and they are not running modern versions of software, modern versions of the kernel. They have a thing, and it never changed. Now, this is not the first time that Arne Bergman has talked about this topic and talked about potentially phasing out 32-bit or the timeline for phasing out certain parts of 32-bit. There was a prior article back in 2020, and of course things have changed since then. It's not like there's much more 32-bit hardware being produced, but the hardware that did exist is now 5 years older. And simply put, 32-bit systems are obsolete when it comes to use in any sort of new products. The only reason to work with them at this point is when there is existing hardware and software to support. Since Bergman is the overall maintainer for architecture support in the kernel, he is frequently asked about whether 32-bit support can be removed. So he concluded the time has come to talk more about that possibility. Now, this is only in talks, and any sort of removal of support wouldn't be every single thing at once. There are areas that still have users which will be kept around, and there's others where literally not a soul on the planet is using it, so why are we still supporting it? Now, a lot of these 32-bit systems are still incredibly important, but you have to ask the question, yes, there are users, but are they using a modern version of the kernel? And if they're not using a modern version of the kernel, nothing is hurt by dropping this. But if there is, that's a different story. People naturally think about desktop machines first, as that's probably your main computing device. If you're running Linux in the 1990s, you had a 32-bit desktop system. Unix systems, though, moved to 64 platforms around 30 years ago, and the Linux desktop made that move around 20 years ago. Even phones and related devices have been 64-bit for the last decade. If those systems were all that Linux had to support, 32-bit support would have been long since removed from the kernel. I don't know, because there are still Chromebooks that go up to about 2017 or so that were still running 32-bit chips. So there could still be a justification in doing so, even if most other people had moved off quite a long time ago. So most of it would be gone, but you would have this like little section of the kernel that still remains supporting it. This slide here represents the transition from 32-bit to 64-bit support, and even at the latest with the ARM desktop here, by 2015, 2016 or so, you're pretty much all 64-bit. And then if we're talking desktop chips, it's considerably earlier than that. If this was all we wanted to support, PC desktops, servers, laptops, and netbooks, by, 2008, anything after that point is 64-bit, and you could probably drop stuff, around 2020, 2022 sort of time, so there's enough time to transition off of that hardware. The world is not all desktops or servers though. Embedded Linux devices exist as well. About 90% of these systems are running on an ARM processor. And this is the real problem. The kernel has accumulated a lot of device tree files describing those systems over the years. Only in the last year has the number of devices for ARM v8 64-bit systems exceeded the number of ARM v7 32-bit systems. Only very recently are there more 64-bit ARM systems in the kernel than 32-bit systems. Of those pre-ARM v7 chips, he said, there are about 10 that could be removed now. These are things where nobody is seen to be using it. If there is a singular user, that can be enough justification to keep something around in the kernel. It would be nice to be able to say that support for others will be removed after a fixed period, 10 years perhaps, but hardware support does not work that way. Instead, want us to think in terms of half-lives. Every so often, it becomes possible to remove support for half of the platforms. It all depends on whether there are users for the processors in question. And this is the important part. The kernel is still adding support for some 32-bit boards. There are new boards being produced, there are boards that are not already supported, there are boards that people want to be using with the Linux kernel. So even if these older 32-bit systems may be removed because nobody is using them, there are still newer ones that actually are being used. But at least 10 new 64-bit boards gain support for each 32-bit one. So it's happening at a lower rate, but it's still happening. There are a number of non-ARM 32-bit architectures that are still 32-bit architectures that still have support in the kernel. These include Arc, Microblaze, Neos 2, OpenRISC, RV32, Spark/Leon, and Xtensor. These are all just random little platforms. I'm sure some of these have uses. I've never heard of any of them. OpenRISC I've heard of. None of the others I have any idea about. All of them are being replaced by RISC-V processors in new products. RISC-V is what you use if you don't care about ARM compatibility. Then there is the dusty corner where no MMU processors without a memory management unit live. These include ARM v7M, M68K, SuperH, and Xtensor. Nobody's building anything with this kind of hardware now, and the only people who are working on them in any way are those who have to support existing systems or to prove that it can be done. There is a lot of this. I will occasionally see people say, oh, don't drop this thing. I'm trying to do this weird thing with the kernel. Like, I don't know if it's possible, but it might be. Maybe it's possible. And again, that's a fine reason to keep support around in the kernel. The kernel doesn't drop things that people are using. If there is a singular person who says, I'm using this thing, don't get rid of it, they'll keep it around if it's not causing any other problems. And there are still people running 32-bit applications that cannot be updated. The solution he's been pushing people towards is a 32-bit user space on a 64-bit kernel. And this is the direction that things have already pretty much gone. Wine, for example, has the ability to do this. I'm sure there are other areas which are not anywhere near as well developed. I believe with Wine there is a bit of a performance overhead, but considering the fact that you'd be dealing with older software and older games, in most cases, it probably doesn't matter. There are some definite pain points that come with maintaining 32-bit support. Most of the complaints, he said, come from developers in the memory management subsystem. The biggest problem there is the need to support high memory. It is complex and requires support throughout the kernel. High memory is needed when the kernel lacks the address space to map all of the installed memory. That tends to be about 800 megabytes on 32-bit systems. So high memory does not mean a high amount of memory, but I guess it is technically a high amount of memory on a 32-bit system. It's basically memory which is not directly mapped by the page tables. Currently, the kernel is able to support 32-bit systems with up to 16 gigabytes of installed memory. Now, if you know about 32-bit systems, you would know this is well outside the range of what a 32-bit system is supposed to be able to support. So it comes with some drawbacks and some overhead and problems this will cause by doing so. Also, these systems are exceedingly rare, and support for them will be going away soon. There are a few 4GB systems out there, most notably Chromebooks. I think most of the Chromebooks around the end of 32-bit Chromebooks had about 4GB of RAM. Systems with 2GB are a bit more common. Even these systems, he said, are a bit silly since the memory costs more than the CPU does. There are some use cases for such systems though. Most 32-bit systems now have less than 1 gigabyte of installed memory because in most cases they're an embedded system and you probably don't need more than 1 gigabyte of installed memory. The kernel soon will not try to support systems with more than 4 gigabytes. Again, this right here, this is the natural limit of a 32-bit system. There are some ideas out there on how to support larger memory 32-bit systems without needing high memory abstraction. Linus Walij? Why are there 2 Linuses in the kernel? Whatever. Is working on entirely separating the kernel and user space address spaces, giving each 4 gigabytes to work with. This is a variant on the 4 gig approach that has originally been tried for many years. It is difficult to make such a system work efficiently, so this effort may never succeed. Now here is a relevant bit of a side tangent. PAE sucks. Why didn't Microsoft take advantage of PAE from Mr. Linus Torvalds back in 2007? PAE really sucks. PAE is Physical Address Extension. This is a way to allow 32-bit systems to address more than 4 gigabytes of memory. The biggest single reason to go 64-bit is exactly because of the physical address space. Your virtual address space needs to be a multiple of the physical one. When you hit 1 gigabyte of RAM, 32-bit virtual memory is no longer acceptable. You literally do need more virtual memory than physical. PAE turned that very simple fact on its head and screwed things up royally. Whoever came up with the idea was totally incompetent and had forgotten all the DOS high memory pains. There's a damn good reason why we left the 286 behind and started using 386s, instead of having high mem crap with Windows into a bigger physical space. Repeat after me. Virtual space needs to be bigger than physical space. Not as big, not smaller, it needs to be bigger by at least a factor of 2, and that's quite frankly pushing it. And you're much better off having a factor of 10 or more. Anybody who doesn't get that is a moron. End of discussion. Reasons why you need a bigger virtual space. You need to map that physical memory somehow, and no, tiny windows into the physical memory simply do not cut it. If you cannot have normal pointers to the physical memory, it immediately means that you need to jump through serious hoops to get there. You additionally need to be able to remap things in alternate ways, i.e. use space, or make space for non-memory issues, virtual page tables, I.O., you name it. Ergo, a factor of 2 is a requirement. PAE was a total and utter disaster. Yes, Linux supported it, and probably did so better than anybody else, but better than anybody else still wasn't very good, because you couldn't use normal pointers to point to arbitrary physical memory. All the memory that couldn't be accessed directly, i.e. anything that didn't fit in the virtual address map, which also had the user space memory in it, was basically limited to special uses only. That kind of duct tape and prayers and lots of specialized knowledge about the load is simply not possible in a desktop environment. Yeah, users have prayers, but they lack the duct tape and the knowledge to work around the problems. And damn it, in this age and date when almost everybody has a gigabyte of RAM in any new machine. Keep in mind, this is from 2007, and anybody who still thinks that not that many people need 64 bits is simply not aware of what he's speaking of. Go back and play with high mem sys on a 286 and stop blathering crap. When you spent the last 10 years of your life working with high mem sys, then you can come back and tell me that we don't need 64 bits. Until that is the case, anybody who still doesn't get why 64 bits is a requirement should just shut up rather than making a total fool of himself. So repeat after me. PAE didn't ever really fix anything. It was a mistake, it was a total failure, and the result of hardware engineers not understanding software. So no, PAE does not mean you can use more than 4 gigabytes of RAM. Even before PAE, the practical limit was around 1 gigabyte, and PAE didn't move that post a fraction of an inch. As a reminder, this is a post from 2007. And we're still talking about 32-bit today. There are still people that think that a 32-bit system is totally workable, and you can certainly make it work, but you don't need to. These systems are ancient at this point. You can use something better. And I don't even mean ancient like, oh, it's a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old system. No, these are in many cases systems, at least on the desktop, that are over 20 years old at this point. Anyway, back to this main article. Another approach is the proposed dense memory model, which does some fancy remapping to close holes in the physical address space. Dense mem can support up to 2 gigabytes and is needed to replace the sparse memory model, the removal of which will eventually be necessary in any case. This work has to be completed before high memory can be removed. Bergman said that he would be interested in hearing from potential users of the dense mem approach. One other possibility is to drop high memory, but allow the extra physical memory to be used as a ZRAM swap device. That would not be as efficient as accessing memory directly, but it is relatively simple and would make it possible to drop the complexity of high memory. Then we have the real fun one, the one that people seem to keep telling me is a completely solved problem. The 2038 problem. The kernel side of the work was finished in 2020. The Muscle C library was updated in that same year, and the GNU C library followed the year after. Some distributors have been faster than others to incorporate this work. Debian and Ubuntu have only become 2038 safe this year. For anyone who doesn't know what the 2038 problem is, basically, with the original way Unix time was being handled. So Unix time is a number of seconds after January 1st, 1970. Using 32-bit, this would run out of seconds sometime early 2038. I forget the exact date, but in the year of 2038. In 64-bit, long time into the future, well past all of these systems being turned into dust. But there is still a lot of software they're going to be running that is going to have 2038 problems. There is a lot of unpatched issues. There's a lot of real weird handling of dates, real weird handling of numbers that should never have been done like this, and those still need to be addressed. Let alone bindings that exist to 32-bit system calls that also still exist and are not 2038 safe, but is still something supported by the kernel. That is going to go away at some point, and that is going to break some software, and that's a good thing, because the software is going to break in 2038 anyway, so it's probably a good idea to break it before we have a serious problem. A related problem is big endian support. This says it is 32-bit only. This is a transcription error, but it is fair to say that it is also obsolete. Its removal is blocked because IBM is still supporting big endian mainframe and PowerPC systems. As long as that support continues, big endian support will stay in the kernel. Big endian versus little endian is basically the order in which bytes are arranged. Feel free to go and look up the Wikipedia article to explain the exact differences and why one is used over the other. There were once 32-bit systems with more than 8 CPU cores, but nobody is using those machines anymore, so support could be removed. Support for ARM v4 processors such as the DEC Strong Arm CPU should be removed. Support for early ARM v6 CPUs, including the OMAP2 and IMX31, complicates everything, and he would like to remove it, even though there are still some Nokia 770 systems in the wild. This is the other point. If a system has people supporting it, but it makes other things that people are actually using harder, there is some debate about whether it still should be kept around. The time is coming for the removal of all these non-device tree board files. Removal support for Cortex-M CPUs, which are no MMU systems, is coming in a couple of years. Developers are eyeing the i486 CPU support, which I believe there was a discussion, I want to say earlier this year, about dropping support, but there's a discussion kind of like every so often as i386 was gone about a decade ago, something like that. But for the i46, it is still currently there. Bergman has sent patches to remove support for KVM on 32-bit CPUs, but there is still one PowerPC user, so that support will be kept for now. Again, if there is one person doing it, that can be enough to keep things around. To summarize, he said the kernel will have to retain support for ARM v7 systems, so that's 32-bit ARM systems, for at least another 10 years. Boards are still being produced with these CPUs, so even 10 years may be optimistic for removal. everything else he said will probably fade away sooner than that. The removal of high memory support has been penciled in for sometime around 2027 and no MMU support around 2028. There will naturally need to be more discussion before these removals can actually happen. So 32-bit support is slowly gonna go away in the kernel, but we're probably still gonna be seeing some of it. Honestly, I would expect some to still be in the kernel post-2038 that just, for some reason, is fine past that point. You're not interacting with anything that's going to cause a problem. But I'll be surprised if a lot of it remains after that point. So let me know, what was the first system you ever used Linux on? Have you been around long enough to use it on a 32-bit system, or have you run some other sort of device outside of the desktop that is using 32-bit? I would love to know. Be sure to go subscribe, and if you liked the video, go like the video. If you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Stelly Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and 32-bit. Yeah, I didn't think this outro through.
Something like this.